Hello students, welcome to week 11 of Introduction to Religious Studies. This week we're going to be speaking about theodicy and evil. Theodicy is the theology of suffering and evil. And in every great religion there is a explanation or an understanding of why people suffer and what is the cause of evil or theodicy. So let us begin. Albert Camus, a French writer, wrote The Plague in 1948. The Plague dealt with existentialism, and it dealt with the idea of human beings suffering and unable to stem the tide, but courageously facing the suffering even as they are losing. In the 20th century, 70 million human beings were killed in the First and Second World Wars and in many of the genocides that took place. They were displaced or enslaved, as well as killed. The word theodicy comes from two Greek words, theos, which means God, and dike, which means justice. Theodicy, the justice of God, meaning justifying the ways of God in the face of chaos and evil in the world. Anomic is a word that means chaotic and evil experiences faced by individuals and societies. It's particularly appropriate that I'm recording this particular lecture today because today is November 14th, 2015, and last night the world was shocked and horrified by a terrorist attack in Paris. That actually was 6 or 7 different attacks that took the lives of over 150 people and put 400 people in the hospital. And so all of our thoughts and minds and prayers are with France today, and we are also thinking about the chaos and evil that are in the world and the problem of terrorism. The book of Job in the Old Testament presents 4 different theodicies that we'll be talking about later, 4 different perspectives on theodicy. In Theravada Buddhism and Hinduism, theodicy is covered by the belief in karma. Karma is the idea that what goes around comes around, that what you sow you shall also reap, although it's usually paired with the idea of the transmigration of the soul. So if you do evil things in this life, then you will suffer a birth in the next life at a lower level of consciousness. If you do good in this life, then you may ascend to a higher level of consciousness in your next life. So in the idea of karma, there's no one to blame for your suffering but yourself. If you're suffering presently, it's probably because you did something bad in a past life. There is obviously no grace in the concept of karma. The question that we're considering today is, why is there so much pain in humanity? The book of Job is primarily about theodicy, the challenge to understand human suffering. Are you familiar with the opening chapter of the book of Job? If not, you might want to read it. It's the equivalent of a 8th century BC action story. It could be fictional. It may or may not be about an actual person. But Job is a man who's blessed by God, and he also is a man who's righteous, and God is proud of him and pleased with Job. And Satan comes to a gathering of angels in heaven, which is interesting in itself, and God engages Satan in a conversation. It says, "Have you seen my remarkable servant Job? There's no one like him." And Satan says, "That's because you have protected him and blessed him. If you let me have a chance at him, I bet he will discontinue his trust of you. In fact, I believe he'll curse you." And so God gives Satan permission to harass Job. And in quick succession, in the first chapter of the book of Job, Job loses all of his possessions and loses all of his children in one conversation. Everything is taken away from him. And the last verse of the first chapter of Job says that Job shaved his hair, he tore his clothes, and he bowed down and worshipped God, and he did not sin. And so we will return to this idea about the book of Job in a moment.
The end to the world and so on. For me, the key was always the book of Job, which I think, if you permit me to say this, it will sound a provocation, but I mean it extremely seriously in an engaged way, is the first great work of critique of ideology. If I were to do, like the best of critique of ideology, forget about Marx, Freud, let's begin with the book of Job. Why? Are you aware what a tremendous thing happens there? We know, okay, let's forget about that stuff. I think it doesn't matter, that comical part at the beginning, how they have a nice evening lunch together, God and devil, and they debate that. But what happened there is that, okay, things go terribly wrong for Job. And then ideology enters. The 3 or 4 theological friends come, remember, and each of them tries to convince Job that there is a deeper meaning to his suffering. The point is not that he's guilty or not. The point is that, the first one says, even if you think you did nothing wrong, God is just, so you must have done something wrong without knowing it. The other guy says, God is just testing you, blah, blah. And I think the greatness of Job is that he doesn't say, I'm innocent. He just insists, no, all these catastrophes that fell on me have no meaning. And then occurs the first miracle. God comes, you remember, and says, every word that you, Job, said is true. He totally dismisses any justification, theological, and then comes the crucial point. Well, I follow my beloved Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Then, nonetheless, Job asks God, okay, but I put it in popular term, but let's cut the crap. Nonetheless, why did all this happen to me? Then, for me, I wonder how you would react to it. I'm here on Chesterton's side. It's the big enigma. That answer by God, where were you when I was creating these, that, monsters, is usually read as an extreme arrogance of God, emphasizing the infinite gap that separates us from God's total perspective. Like, who are you, a tiny piece of shit, even knowing that? Chesterton does something which is for me so shockingly simple but profound. He turns around the perspective, and God's answer is for Chesterton that is the following one. You think you are in trouble, but look at the entire universe that I created. It's all one big mess. Everything goes wrong and so on. That's
Slavoj Zizek, a Czechoslovakian philosopher, on his perspective on the book of Job. So the theodicy of mystical participation, according to Peter Berger, this theodicy of mystical participation justifies suffering through the loss of self and mystical participation in the divine, or the absorption into a larger spiritual reality. This was common in primal societies, where the sense of individuality was not highly developed as it is in modern complex societies. Lucien Levy-Bruhl called this merging of self with others the law of participation. This is mysticism, getting lost in union with the all or the one. A great example of this would be when a soldier sees a hand grenade tossed and he's with his friends, and he leaps onto the hand grenade and absorbs the blast to save his friends. His family obviously grieve, but there's a sense of meaning or purpose in this soldier's sacrifice, in which he sacrificed himself for his friends or for his country. This is the theodicy of mystical participation, or the mother who sacrifices herself for her children. There's also the future this-worldly theodicy, as opposed to otherworldly theodicy. This was the theodicy of Israel. Out of Israel's travail there emerged a radical this-worldly eschatology. In ancient Israel there was no particular belief in the afterlife. Israel's hope was in a future liberation in this world. Western consciousness has been deeply influenced by the vision of a peaceable kingdom, or a new age on earth, or an age of shalom, some have called it, the kingdom of God on earth. This leads to millenarian theodicy, which is a compensation for present suffering, is put off into the future, but it's a future realized on this earth, as opposed to some faraway place. In monotheism, there tends to be four kinds of theodicy, which we find in the book of Job, as we alluded to earlier. The first is suffering as punishment for sin. There's the story in the Old Testament of Manasseh in 2 Kings 21, who sinned grievously, and therefore punishment was coming to him, but then he repented. The three friends of Job, when they show up, they spend a week in silence with them, empathetically, but then they say, okay, Job, fess up, tell us what you did. You must have done something to make God angry. This is the idea of, what did I do to make God angry? Then there's also suffering as a test or trial of faith, and you also see this in the first chapter of Job, when you see God praising Job and Satan saying, let me have a crack at him. A contemporary mythology that may illustrate this idea of suffering as a test or trial of faith would be the Hunger Games. Then there's a theodicy of protest, which is an anti-theodicy. And then for this one, I think of Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump, who lost both of his legs in the Vietnam War, but his life was saved by Forrest Gump, but nevertheless his life was consumed by bitterness and anger, because he thought that he should have died instead of being living on as a cripple. And let's take a quick view of Forrest Gump.
No shrimp.
Where the hell's this God of yours?
It's funny Lieutenant Dan said that, because right then, God showed up. Now me, I was scared, but Lieutenant Dan, he was mad.
You call this a storm? Oh, you son of a bitch! Oh! It's time for a showdown! You and me! I'm right here! Come and get me!
This is the theodicy of protest, in which Lieutenant Dan gets in God's face and shakes his fist at God and dares him to take him down. I remember once when my son was about 2 years old and he got angry. I did something to make him angry, and he began yelling at me and flailing his fists at me. And I remember my reaction was amusement, but also love and tenderness. And I picked him up and held him and said, "I'm sorry I upset you. I didn't mean to make you mad." My response was one of love, and that is the idea of the theodicy of protest, is that is honest prayer to God. And then there's Lieutenant Dan's resolution.
Dan looks like.
Well, yes, I would.
That's him right there. And let me tell you something about Lieutenant Dan.
Forrest. I never thanked you for saving my life.
He never actually said so, but I think he made his peace with God.
So the idea of the theodicy of protest is it leads to a resolution and a cathartic peace with God. Then finally there's the theodicy of submission or trust. In Job 13:15, after all of these things happen to him and after he's accused of having sinned, he finally says, and even his wife says, "Why don't you curse God and die?" And Job's response, that even if he kills me, yet will I trust him. I'm going to trust him even though I do not understand the reasons why I have not sinned, and yet I still trust him even if he kills me. There's also the free will defense, which is popularized by philosopher John Hick. He asks us to imagine the world Imagine a world that is a permanent hedonistic paradise that would not accomplish God's purposes. Courage and fortitude would have no meaning in such a world. Generosity, kindness, agape, prudence, unselfishness could not even be formed or experienced if we didn't have problems or pain. And so God's purpose was never to ensure human comfort, but to engage in soul-making. And I thought of a great illustration of John Hicks's imaginary world in which nothing ever goes wrong, which is the human dystopia in the Pixar film WALL-E.
Now, we did that yesterday. I don't want to do that.
Well, then what do you want to do?
I don't know. Something.
Make a place scream.
So this is a world where every single need is provided. There's no need for pain. And people become very fat, unexercised, self-indulged. So this is what the world might be like if we didn't have to encounter pain and challenge and difficulty. God is involved in making souls through pain and suffering. Process theodicy goes along with process philosophy, which was developed by Alfred North Whitehead. According to process philosophy, all reality is constituted by process and change, from the least to the greatest. The world consists of free entities that freely interact with one another. Process theodicy argues that nothing, not even God, can wholly determine the being of others, because God has voluntarily chosen to limit himself to respect free moral choice of his creatures. Evil may be attributed to others' decisions. God cannot eliminate evil. God can only minimize it while maximizing the possibilities of good for good. And this is because of human free will. And that's our chapter on theodicy and evil, to be continued next week with ethics. Thank you very much for your time.